Morning, everyone. Welcome to another forecast discussion. Today's the 31st, last day of March here. And we're forecasting again for the 16 to 20. As usual, we'll start off by looking at the most recent verifications verification, and then we'll get into the forecast. We have a little more time today to dive into issues or any particular topics. So if you have, especially for anyone who's kind of new to the contest and you want us to spend a little bit more time on a particular part of the contest, even just about subseasonal forecasting or how to make a forecast, all that kind of stuff, please, this is a good kind of day to do it. So feel free to bring that up. And let me just throw it out to everyone else. Other than our normal sort of agenda, does anyone want to make sure we try to cover a particular topic today? No? Okay, well, we can get into it. I don't think there's too much new, but just a quick housekeeping note. You've probably seen this, but on the archive page, we added those performance charts to the archive tab up here. So in case you're looking for those again, I'm not going to go. Not going to spend a lot of time on these unless anyone wants to point them out. But that's where they're located. So okay, so let's start with the most recent forecast, and again, everyone should just feel free to kind of jump in whenever. So again, the most recent forecast verification was forecast made on the 10th, verifying for the 25th, 29th, and I'll sort it here. Shockingly, the forecast verified pretty warm. The verification here was 67.7. That compares to your 30-year. I was being sarcastic, of course, but that compares to the 30-year of 86, 10-year of 81, and it was near the low end of the forecast. But there were a few folks down there who did quite well. Professor Decker, Michael, who's on the line, Paul Roundy. That number looked kind of really out there at first, but actually Paul's number verified only about 7 HDDs from verification. Looks like he would have performed better in terms of CRPS, but I think his spread was quite large, and I think that's why Professor Lupo here actually did pretty well, because he had a pretty narrowed in kind of range in terms of his number. But yeah, I'll sort by CRPS just so we can see that too. There's the CRPS sort, so highest to lowest. And most folks did perform better than the 30-year normal. The 30-year normal benchmark is down here. But the CFS obviously struggled here, way too cold with the almost 100 HDDs. What else? I'll pull up the Dynacast here, just so folks can actually see what the pattern looked like. So again, this is the 25th to the 29th. So let's pull that up. I think I got it over here. Yeah. Hit it again. Just make sure it's the latest. All right. Yeah. No doubt. That's a pretty warm forecast, right? For the heating degree areas or consuming areas, Chicago, New York, Atlanta, basically where most people live, with the exception of, obviously California and stuff. So pretty warm there. We could also see where it ranked. Just if you're curious how it ranked, don't forget, you can just click over to WDD, and Maxar provides a ranking as compared to the last 50 plus years, actually since 1950, so a lot more than that. So you can see it was definitely on the warmer side, but not the warmest on record. We actually had a couple years up here that were down 45, 47 HDDs. Let's also take a look at the report. I pulled that up here, I think, just a second ago. Yeah, this is it. So this is the Maxar report from the 10th, verifying for this period. So what was everyone, or at least what were they thinking? What were the models kind of looking like then? So again, here's the Maxar forecast. Definitely from a pattern configuration, definitely looks like they had the right idea, right? It's not like this is a 180-degree error or anything like that. a lot of warmth in the eastern parts of the country. We know from the Dynacast that the warmth actually extended into Minnesota and some of these areas too, and that gave a little bit of a boost. But general pattern configuration looks pretty good, generally speaking. And then here are the EC and CFS models. The CFS, the CFS kind of had just a normal to below normal kind of look for most of the country, and obviously that's not what verified. Here are the kind of numbers, and again, it verified, what do we say, about 67 HDDs there. Let's just, let me just stop there, open it up here. Any thoughts here in terms of this forecast period, and in particular, obviously it verified quite warm. Any sense as to, in hindsight, why it verified so warm, and any kind of lessons learned from this forecast period?
Just one thing I saw that was interesting. If you go back to the report, they noted the Midwest had a risk of actually colder than what they were forecasting, and what actually happened was the opposite.
That's a good point. Yeah.
Hey, Dave.
Oh, yeah. Yep.
Dark Angelo here.
Hey, Dave.
Hey, good morning, everyone. So I sometimes think it's instructive for those who did the worst to somehow offer their opinion. And I think I was on definitely the wrong side of the distribution on this one, being close to the 30-year, and everyone had a warmer view. So I just kind of want to share some of my thoughts. Obviously give credit to those who were on that warm side. And I think there was a really aggressive call by Dr. Roundy, and I think he had a 60. It was, it wasn't that warm, but it was pretty darn warm. One thing I was thinking that might have occurred in this period was, two things. One was there was a distinct timing issue with regards to the advancement of cold in the mid-con. That cold tended to slide more into the Intermountain West and Southwest, and didn't really reside in the mid-con or even West Texas. And sometimes I think what we get into when we get into these kind of like distinct week 3 periods is that, sometimes it's right idea, wrong timing. In my case, it was, maybe more wrong idea and wrong timing. But there was plenty of cold that was still offered in this period. It was just tending to go towards places of lower demand. The one thing I wanted to know if you had a precip verification for that window.
Yeah, we can look at that.
Yeah,
those are really good points. I want to come back to some of your points here too, but let's look at the precip. I think they have it here. Yeah, there we go.
Awesome.
All right. There, yeah.
So one thing that we were seeing when we were looking at this period, we were thinking that it would be a period of really strong negative SOI, which would potentially enhance kind of mid-latitude or subtropical moisture to some extent, and to be a fairly active storm pattern across the United States. I think the precip bears that out quite well, right? When you're talking in the order of like 200% of normal or more from Nebraska to Pennsylvania. My expectation with the negative SOI, though, was to have it look more like what we saw a few weeks in mid-February, when you would have tracked heavier precip for, let's say Dallas to Atlanta to, say, Virginia. I think had that been the case, I'm not trying to say that it's a justification for a lousy forecast, but in these late winter, early spring periods, we know that 3 or 4 days of precip in the kind of deep south or mid south can really, really change your HDD look an awful lot. So I was looking for something that would be shift that axis of heavy precip, more than a few hundred miles, but probably more like 500 miles farther south. And I think that might have maybe thrown the HDD look for that 5-day window into a little bit more, something closer to the 30 or 10-year normal. But the SOI look was, I maybe hinged more on that, and dismissed the risk that, even in that scenario, the Southeast Ridge can really pop.
Yeah. Is there? I appreciate you bringing some of those points to light. And I thought you said something also that's interesting. It's worth us taking a look at to timing. You know, uh, that's always a very delicate and difficult issue when you're forecasting. Almost like synoptic level periods in the medium range. 5-day composites out, 20 days out. Let's just take a quick look here. We can you can toggle kind of back and forth 5 days. Just see how this period evolved. You can definitely see some variability here. This 5-day period, in fact, we can look. This is just the 5-day, sorry. This is the 5-day period before the verification period. So this is looking at the 20th to the 24th. And we could look at the WDDs and see where that verified. Yeah, this period verified just 5 days earlier, basically at the 30-year normal, right? So Dave's forecast, shifted by a couple days, and you're spot on. And I don't, I think to Dave's point, this is not about making excuses or whatever. It's about again, did this period end up as just an extended period, 2-3 weeks of anomalous warmth, or were we seeing a lot of synoptic variability? And we should look 5 days forward too, though. Let's look 5 days forward, and we can do that with this tool here. You guys have seen this, where NDA or Maxar provides their strip. I call it the next 15 days. So there's the dates on the left, and then we're looking at the EC ensemble model here, color coded by the departure from normal. So you can see the next 5 days, and they aggregated up down here. So the next 5 days, the EC ensemble has it at about 80, almost 80 HDDs, and that's pretty close to normal, right? This thing's blocking my view here. There we go. It's actually slightly above normal. So, and the official forecast from Maxar is just slightly below normal. So again, we're certainly in a period that's verifying super warm, this 5-day period, but you go to 5 days earlier and you're basically normal. You go to the 5 days after this and you're basically normal. So I just think, I really think it's a good point. Those kinds of, these kinds of patterns where you're seeing a lot of fluctuation back and forth are really difficult to forecast and difficult to resolve, right? Do you try, we've talked about this ad nauseum, do you try to identify that warm period and stick your head out there and say, I think it's going to be here? Or do you say, you know what, I don't have skill at that long lead window, 20 days out, in timing a 5-day period of warmth, so I'm just going to fade it toward normal. Those are issues I think we as meteorologists in the industry, you're constantly dealing with and trying to best communicate, through the numbers and through communications. Go ahead.
Let me add one more point to that. That the communication part is super important. And one thing I wanted to note was, I think frequently the natural gas market tends to look at these things a little bit more broadly. So while we are focused on this distinct 5-day period, the market tends to try to more see the sentiment of the extended period. Now, an exceptional 5-day window of warmth or cold can skew that, and this was an exceptionally warm period. Don't make no mistake about it. And of course, we're in also a spring period that is on the heels of an exceptionally warm winter. So the impact of this is really muted to the gas market. Virus shutdowns aside, but often I think the way we look at it in the marketplace is, rather than looking at a distinct 16 to 20-day period, is to actually issue some guidance around kind of the sentiment. I think that's the best way I can put that, is the broad view of, say, like weeks 2, 3, and 4, or even just weeks 3 and 4 broadly. We look at it in two terms where I work. One is general direction, above or below average, and then 2, some of the volatility around that. So the point being, the period before was cold, and the period that we're entering, I think today, is normal, is taken into account in a sense when we try to describe that. Now, verifying that is next to impossible because everyone can come up with a way to try to quantify that, both trajectory and the volatility around it. But we're presented here with a unique problem, and the problem is to forecast for a distinct 5-day period. So I think it's what we're doing. I think is great because it's easy to verify and simple to discuss in hindsight. But when we actively communicate this with people in the trading world, it's much more nuanced. I think it's good that you pointed that out, and I wanted to add that kind of the sentiment is important, but a very difficult phenomenon, thing to grasp. The market isn't necessarily trading around like moving up or down in HDD. We can't draw a correlation very easily.
Let's take a look at, since we're talking about how variable, at least it looks like this period is. I always like to take a sneak peek a week ahead. So let's just see how things are rolling forward with next week's forecast and verification. Where am I? All right, 10th. So that's this week's verification. All right, we'll skip 1 week ahead. So this is going to be for the 1st to the 5th. So we can do this on, I think we can do this on Dynacast. Let's just see what they're projecting at the moment.
I just want to mute that. It was raining. I was like, we can do it later. Okay. And then Mom and I took your car. We just took it when she came home. That's good. Yeah. So I'm on this call till like 11:30.
Okay. Looks like this period's coming in, projected to come in around 70
piece on Jared
at the moment.
I sent it to you. Yeah.
And let's see. Again, it could change, right? But we know it's only a few days away, so it probably won't be too different. Oh, it looks like Professor Decker, if this holds up, Professor Decker will have a heck of a good forecast. Looks like it's just a little bit below the 30-year in this case. That's where it's coming in. Looks like a lot of forecasts in that range. Doesn't look like there's too many forecasts that are strongly divergent, except the CFS. Again, it looks like it's going to suffer. And maybe that's a good segue to also just taking a more macro look at things, the 30-day and 90 or heating season. I can't help but notice that the bias of the CFS. I was looking at this earlier. So in the last 30 days, 5 forecasts, the CFS has a 15 HDD bias. EC, also not great at all. Pretty significant bias there. And just looking at the heating season, this is not a short-term phenomena. The CFS has a 16 HDD bias this heating season. I mean, that's not trivial, right? I mean, we know what the sigmas are each week, and they're not much usually. Yeah, that's a pretty healthy value right there. That's not noise, right? The EC is about 8, so about half that. I'm dying to look at. We're close to this. I know a couple different folks on the team are looking at this in different ways, but hopefully soon we can just put in a kind of a bias corrected view, and just like I'd love to see the skill of the CFS, even if you do it almost like in sample, just removing the 16 and just kind of seeing how it would have compared week to week and whatnot. But clearly there's been a big problem with the CFS this season. Yeah. Any thoughts? Any additional thoughts on the performance of the models here, or anything else before we shift to the forecast?
Dave D'Arcangelo, you brought up earlier the impacts that an active precipitation period can have on an HDD forecast. Could you elaborate on that a little bit? Are there like rules of thumb that you can follow, or is it pretty variable?
That's a good question. It is fairly variable. We're in a period in late March where almost always that precip would be rain. And the way I was thinking about it was for a lot of the South now, if you go roughly from, say, South Carolina to Texas, you really shouldn't be accumulating, more than a handful of HDDs. So, if you have a few days where you say crush your high temperature, it's not about really seeing your low temperatures blowout to be very cold, but when you crush your high temperatures and you say you have a few days in, say, Dallas and Atlanta that are stuck in the 50s, you can really start racking up some HDDs. But there's a little bit of seasonality. If we're in January, this could look a lot different because the whole country's kind of maxing out on HDDs. Then it becomes even a bit more variable because I think we know that the difference between, like, say, a week of rain in Chicago and a week of snow, that could be a substantial amount of HDDs. So the variability in the spring is obviously less, as with just normal spring weather. But I was banking on the South having a period of precip, and it's not been a bad bet for the balance of winter and spring. It just didn't click for me for this 5-day window. But there's no real rule of thumb. This is a little bit more of back of the envelope thinking on my part.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that. Just again, I agree with, like, there's not a lot of hard data. Maybe there's some, but a lot of different rules of thumb, right? But like in the winter, you might look at, and even into March, if you have some sense of like a stormy activity or a stormy pattern, and maybe you think there's enough cold and you see some snow potential, and you increase risk of a nor'easter or something like that up across key areas. So then you might think there could be some feedback effects, right? And sort of nonlinear kind of, hey, if the storm track is really active and there's a little bit of cold air, there's increased risk then that we get a 6 or 12-inch snowstorm or maybe more in the Northeast, which then could, feed back a little bit on temperatures for at least, a synoptic window, right? For a 5-day period, nighttime lows, higher albedo, things like that. So sometimes that factors into my thinking. It's tricky though, right? Because you could see even the way I'm describing it, there's a lot of ifs, right? And of course you're talking about like 11 to 15, let's say we're talking about 11 to 15 day forecast or 16 to 20. So I think you got to be really careful with that. And it's easy to overemphasize those risks. I don't know if I have it up here. Let's see if I have it on my, but in the summer, I think it was just winter. In the summer, this is just a correlation page where I look at like different correlations between like snow cover and HDDs and AMO and HDDs. I thought I had summer, but I don't think I do here. Anyway, I was going to bring up the point that in the summer you look at things in terms of soil, precipitation / soil moisture to kind of feed back on patterns. Patterns tend to slow down a little bit, become more stagnant in summer. So again, I'm using some subjectivity here. There's some I think research that supports this. Even CPC has like a drought forecast, a soil moisture forecast that they use in their seasonal forecast. You can just Google it, CPC seasonal forecast, soil moisture. And the bottom line is that the rule of thumb kind of is if you get a lot of whatever dry conditions, say in Texas and areas like that, it can feed back and increase the strength and longevity of like heat ridges in that area. And importantly, that the models, the numerical guidance may not fully resolve that. And so if you see something like that, or if you have an inclination that the South in particular is going to, have a dry or wet for that matter, but let's say a dry May, June, again, that may influence your thinking in terms of a data point that suggests potential more risk for heat and higher CDDs and things like that. Any other questions there, Zach?
No, that's good. Thank you.
Okay. There's a lot of good
one more
research
thing
potential there. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, that's I agree with everything you said. It's just the hard part is being in the season and kind of seeing it, go in the face of that. Last summer, it was hot coast to coast, and it was one of the, if not the wettest spring and early summer periods I think we recorded for like the Tennessee Valley, Ohio Valley, and basically Midwest. So there's a lot of things that that was that last year?
Yeah, last May
Yeah.
and June. Yeah.
Yeah, not so much Ohio Valley. I guess lower Ohio Valley, especially like that Oklahoma, Kansas, Missouri region. We had one of the latest planting seasons on record for the corn and soybean crop. There was talk about crop failures, and that didn't pan out, and the cool summer outlooks didn't pan out. This last 12 months has been just absolutely atrocious for kind of any kind of medium subseasonal predictions. I'm glad to kind of maybe the virus will help us turn the page with this. This has really been a really difficult stretch in forecast space. Where what might click one week just doesn't click another week, and there's very little continuity, and a lot of preconceived notions. Have just been kind of blown to bits. Doesn't mean that doesn't work in the future. I don't think it doesn't mean all hope is lost or we abandon it. But it's been a tough stretch. The water one is last summer was one of it. And then this, you're saying you had any thoughts, kind of parting thoughts here? I'm glad to see winter 1920 out the door, frankly.
No, I mean, again, I think that's, and there's numbers to back what Dave's showing up, or back up what Dave's saying. Look at these correlation scores this winter of the EC and CFS. I mean, again, I'm maybe there's a bug, and if someone sees something, let me know with this data. But these correlation scores, if you can't see them, I know it's kind of small, but the EC, this is up through a couple. Yeah, I don't have some of the March, but this includes all of the data since November through, I don't know, February. The EC correlation is slightly negative, and the CFS correlation is like minus 0.25 or minus 2.4. You look at previous years, just the benchmark. Year before that, the winter. These are winters. We're looking at heating seasons. 0.4, 0.3, 0.7. The EC 0.7 2 years ago. Year before that, the EC was 0.4. The CFS 0.4. So yes, something happened this winter. Some combination of the winter just being more difficult to forecast, and or the models, whatever. Sometimes sometimes you think you're going to make improvements, right, and they backfire, right? We obviously see that in industry a lot, right? Usually, cars get better, right? But occasionally a new model comes out and there's a problem, right? So I think there's going to be a lot of research looking back at this winter to better understand why these scores were so low. And I also, I know we keep going back and forth, but we have a little more time today, right? So I think these are good conversations for everyone. I think, Dave was bringing up, we were talking about, these relationships, these signals, the different teleconnection relationships with seasonal patterns, whether it's ENSO, AMO, soil moisture, snow cover, things like that. I just wanted to echo my own subjective experiential view too, and I think it aligns with Dave that, these relationships, like even like soil moisture and summer or like spring soil moisture, precipitation, and summer temperatures. I've also noted what Dave's seeing, where these relationships, there's in particular some of them, and I'm making a generalization, there can be a lot of variability. Some of those rules of thumbs that work maybe up through 5-10 years ago, they don't work as well. In other words, I've seen it too, where you can have even wet summers in Chicago. It used to be, well, if you have a wet summer in Chicago, it's not going to be hot. You know what? We've seen it now over the past 10 years where it's just extremely muggy. Maybe it's not like 100 degrees, but instead it's like low 90s, and the nighttime lows are in the 70s every day, and it's humid as heck. And so they're manifested more in the low temperatures as opposed to the highs. But we're seeing these situations now where you can have really hot and humid summers and things like that. And I suspect, again, this is just my experiential view and my 2 cents, and it's probably worth what you pay for it. I just think, climate change is having a very significant effect, right? And maybe an overwhelming effect than some of these variables that we used to use that used to be good barometers, in particular in the summer. Like, hey, again, if it's really wet, you don't have to worry about a hot summer. I think some of these other signals, the oceans becoming so warm, more humidity, things like that, are just trumping some of these other signals. But again, just my 2 cents. And I think the main point, though, that that I want to emphasize, I think Dave said too, don't, just because a signal worked for 20 years, just because, ENSO or North American snow cover had a zero point 0.4 correlation or 0.4, definitely you have to, break it down as much as you can. Make sure that relationship, you feel confident that the relationship that was there 10, 20, 30 years ago is still relevant today, because we know, right, that climate change and other factors are there, right? And we know that they're having major global impacts. So just to make an assumption that something that worked 30 years ago is still going to work today, that may not be the case.
Hey, Dave, one more thing. I don't mean to sidetrack this whole or hijack this whole conversation, but these are all good points. One thing I just had a thought of, and I wanted to point out in addition to that, is the way we sometimes try to deal with this, in real time, on a trading desk, is instead of worrying about what the forecast is and hitting the forecast, because no one, frankly, like the market doesn't quote unquote see your forecast, right? Like your own community, your trade desk and your customers see it, but you don't, the larger community doesn't see that. So there's really likely no impact from, I've never stood on a soapbox and been like, yeah, I nailed a week 3 HDD forecast or a CDD forecast, and and then had rotten vegetables thrown at me because the market was doing something different. So I don't really, I don't tend to overly tout that, although that skill is still important. I think there's a subset of skills which come from that, which is understanding the sentiment at which the market will be kind of geared towards. There's always kind of an underlying theme that, when I say the market, I mean like the weather community at large. That's other meteorologists, vendors, people like you. And I'm not saying I have some great insight into their headspace, but the collective view of that meteorological community tends to set a tone in the marketplace. Last summer, an example was, the rainy, wet spring and early summer kind of led the consensus to tend to suppress CDD outlooks for summer. So I think when you think about opportunity, you can start to talk in terms of, I don't know what the week 3 is going to be. I don't even know what the week 2 might be, but I think surprises will tend to be in X direction. And try to help your customers navigate around what is the baseline, and then where might things go wrong, right? I think sometimes an interesting approach when you make a forecast, even if you make a week 3 HGD forecast, is to kind of take a step back and ask yourself the question, when this goes wrong, not if it goes wrong, but when this goes wrong, which direction will it likely go wrong in, and could it be by a lot? So I think there was some introspective people, I don't include myself in this category, but back in November of this past year, the baseline expectation for winter was really quite cold. And I think there was some rather introspective people when we started seeing some mild forecasts for late November and early December. They were able to capitalize on that view, which is that, people's baseline is geared particularly cold. Especially on the heels of a fairly cold first half of November. It tended to kind of set the cold expectations in concrete. So, Dave, look at a period like maybe November 15th through like December 15th. That was a preview of kind of how all of winter would go. But my point is that the smart money, the smart science out there, and when I say science, I mean both on the meteorological sense, but also having a view of where the market expectation was setting up. There it is. That's really a good one. The baseline expectation for winter was much, much colder than that. And there was a few smart individuals that are like, well, maybe it's not hot. Maybe they weren't betting on hot, but they were at least helping their clients to, detach from that cold expectation. And I think some of our more insightful views is doing those two things, understanding where the baseline for the market is and how might that be different.
It's a really good point. Any questions for Dave before we move on to the forecast? Right. That was if anyone ever see Bridesmaids? That was Dave and I our version where we were trying to one up each other. All right, so let's so here's the forecast from the 31st today, right? Let's see here. Let's look at our range, and I'm going to turn it. We'll get some students here involved and some of our other participants. Looks like the range. Again, we're forecasting for the 15th to the 19th, so we're getting into. I think Dave brought this up, but we're getting to kind of a more of a dead part of the season. HDDs aren't, you can see the HDDs are kind of dropping here, kind of in between seasons, so to speak. But anyway, we've got a range CFS 66 down at 45 on the low end. So we got a decent range here of 20 HDDs or so. So I know we got a few folks on the line, Michael, Philip, Zach, who wants to kick us off and talk about their forecast?
I can go.
All right, Michael.
All right, so my forecast this week was for 53 HDDs with a normal spread of 16.1, which I should mention has a little bit of an asterisk because this is a slightly lower confidence forecast for me. But I didn't think I needed to change the spread since I think it'll still end up within the spread anyway. Looking at the teleconnections, the AO is still forecast to be positive. Can't really remember a time it's been positive for this long, but still going strong with positive. You can see right there. NAO is forecast to still be slightly on the negative side. But it seems to be heading back towards positive, and based on the abysmal way it's performed in the 14-day time frame, looking at that correlation at under 0.5, I think that means I should do the opposite of whatever it's saying. So I'm taking that as another warm signal, but also as a almost I don't know if conflicting is the right word, but I'm worried as a risk to the forecast that this might actually become a sustained blocking near Greenland. So that could definitely push some of the temperatures colder. The PNA is still forecast to be negative, and that has done reasonably well over the past few months. So I stuck with that as being on the negative. And let's see. So it looks like they're not. Doesn't look like they're as confident in long range. The NAO will remain negative, but we'll see. The NAO forecast hasn't been, as I mentioned, hasn't been particularly helpful this year, until you figured out to ignore it, essentially. And last, we've got the CPC forecast, which was fairly cold for a lot of important areas: Chicago, New York, Boston. I think even Philadelphia were on the below normal side, with most of the above normal being in the south, where it doesn't really matter for HDDs at this point. Yeah, you can see the only other warm place is the Pac Northwest, which other than Seattle doesn't really have that much of an impact on the HDDs. So like I said, the only risk I can see anyway. Doesn't mean there aren't more risks that I didn't look at, but is the NAO. If it does end up staying negative, we could see a much cooler forecast than what I have, maybe closer to the 30-year normal. But again, so that's why I wasn't really sure which direction to go with the spread. So I took a look at where the other forecast spread was, and noticed that even if it's plus minus 16 from 53, I'm still well within the range of where I think the forecast or where we'll end up verifying. So um, while this is a lower confidence forecast, that's not reflected in the spread, at least for me anyway. Lower confidence forecast.
Hey, Michael.
Yeah.
If I can, I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit. And I should have said this at the beginning, but let's go through the 2-minute drill here real quick. So just boil, again, pretend like Dave Darkangelo is your client, right? And you're giving him your 2-minute summary, and he's short on time. He needs the facts. He needs the most relevant information about that 16 to 20 in literally 2 minutes or less. Just do that same message again, but just do it, like again, it's just boil it all down in a minute or two, and then let's iterate on that.
Okay. Okay. So my HDD forecast was 53 HDDs, which is a little bit warmer than the 30-year. Normal spread of 16.1. The main reasons for this was the NAO heading back towards neutral, although there is risk that it could remain negative, which would be a colder risk to the forecast. The AO remains positive, which is a warm factor. The PNA looks to be remaining negative, which is a cooler cooler west factor, warmer east. The kind of outlier here is the CPC, which has major demand areas like Chicago, Boston, Philadelphia, and New York in the cooler sector of about 55% chance below normal. As for some risks to the forecast, like I said, the NAO could, if it remains negative, could bring the HDD forecast to around the 30-year normal, maybe even a little cooler than that. So if there is a risk to be had here, I think it lies on the cooler side of 53. There is also slightly less risk, but there is also a risk that it's warmer than 53, of course. No forecast perfect. So I can answer, if you have time, I can answer that question as to how I think it ends up warmer than 53. But 53 is my forecast here. Any questions?
Yeah, I had a question. So it sounds like, and I'm putting my client hat on. You said you were dismissed. You brought up CPC, but then you dismissed CPC, saying they're too cold. Why do you think they're too cold? What are they missing? What are you saying that they're not?
Well, I think they're. I'm not saying that I think they're too cold. I'm saying that they're on the other end of the spectrum. That they're on the cold side. So I factored that into my forecast because without the CPC, I would have been closer to 50, maybe 49-ish. Because looking at just the teleconnections and using the, I guess, eyeball bias correction I've been using for the NAO and AO and keeping them brings them to the positive side, which allows for, at the very least, warmth in the east with a negative PNA, which is, I think, still most of the demand areas. So I'm not. I think the CPC they use a lot of different data sets that I don't, and I also don't have access to make their forecast. So they're seeing something in their in-house model that I'm not with the teleconnections. I think is why they're colder.
And you're not. So you're weighting it somewhat, but you're also not weighting it fully. And at the end of the day, you're not completely sure why they're that cool, but it's just you're not seeing that. you're not seeing it that cool.
Yeah, like I said, the teleconnections are conflicting in my view a little bit with the CPC. That's not to say I think the CPC can't be correct. Which is why I'm at 53 rather than 48 or 49. So, but I also think the with the spread I have of 16.1, I think that that covers most of the bases at 53. So it's more than likely that that it remains within the spread. Considering that it'd have to be pretty warm or pretty cold to get out of the spread, if that helps.
Okay, and just last thought, and now I'm taking my hat off. I think you answered that pretty well, but I just want to say that that is a very, if you're that is a very common situation to get those kind of questions, and traders, will get upset if you can't answer them. In other words, if you're going to dismiss or discount another group, which is fine, right? But you want to be able to say why, right? You don't want to be, and I think you answered this pretty well. So this is not really criticism; it's just awareness in the future. If you're going to have a 50 HDD colder forecast and say Maxar, right? They're going to be there. It's not just going to be like, oh, well, you're colder and you're Dave, so that's cool. Um, unless you're so much better over 10 years that that's how people look at you, but chances are that's not how the world works. So the first question they're going to be like, Dave, why are you discounting Maxar? What the hell are you seeing that they're not? Why should I believe you? So just be prepared. Just think about those kinds of things. It's okay to be different, but just make sure that you have justification to be different. So.
Hey, Dave, I'm going to ask Mike a question too. That's cool?
Yeah, go, please.
All right. I love this. This is fun. We get to turn the tide on 25 years of pent-up anger here. No, you did a good job, Michael. It was you did it in under 2 minutes, like David had asked. One question I think might come your way in this situation, which is you mentioned 3 teleconnections: the PNA, the AO, and the NAO. So far this winter, early spring, which of those teleconnections has mattered the most, and which teleconnection has been best predicted by the models at, say, day 15? I'm not expecting you to answer it now, but that might be a question you would get. If you know it, awesome. But
if I don't have any empirical data to back this up, but just based on from basically memory, is the PNA has performed the best over the course of the year at 15 days. I think it's, if Dave, you can pull up the correlation number real quick. I think even now I think it performs better by like say 0.15 on their correlation number. So yeah, the PNA is at 0.74, which at 15 days I think that's pretty good.
I agree.
And the NAO we saw was at 0.48, which that's at that point I think, or 0.45, my mistake. So that's, to me, that means do the opposite of whatever it's saying. And the AO hasn't been much better at 0.49, which is just a coin flip as to whether it's right or wrong. So obviously and this is kind of been the theme. This is why back in, I want to say maybe it was early February, sometime in February, I don't remember when, I started to aim towards the upper end of guidance. You see those with the 2 red lines on the lower forecast there, and aim towards the higher red line whenever I was looking at these forecasts, because that's usually where it ended up being. As to which one has been the most impactful, I would argue, and again, I don't have any data for this, but I would argue the AO has been the most important, because you can't, like, we never got any real sustained cold. It was always just these transient cold shots that just kind of passed by, with the main bulk of it being to the north in Minnesota or Maine or upstate New York, and places that don't really have too many people. Missing New York and Chicago most of the time. And I think a bigger reason for that, and as to why it was the AO, and the reason why the AO was so strong is, you know, probably there's forcing things that I don't really look at that I should. But you know, I'd have to argue the AO was the most important in keeping the cold away.
All right, I'm just looking at the time and I want to get a couple other folks involved. Just real quick though, let's bookmark for next time that your comments about correlation. Michael, I'm not sure I agree exactly about the 0.4 and stuff, but let's come back to that, or being like negative. Let's come back to that maybe in the next discussion, just for the sake of time, but just don't let me forget. Philip or Zach, who wants to go next?
Sure.
I think that's
So my forecast. Oh, sorry. My forecast ends up being fairly similar to Mike's, since I have some of the same factors that I put in. And I think the main difference is I also factor in a 15% tropical signal, along with a slightly different weighting of the 10-year mean / 30-year moving average. And so when you put all my numbers together, I end up with 54.4 with a normal spread around 16.7. And the main difference I see is that the tropical signal looks a little, it looks the messiest of all the signals. And if you look at the lag composites of the MJO versus for phase 8 versus phase 4 and phase 1, you see that there's some disagreement as to where the pattern is going to be for the northern US. So that was probably the least confident part. And at least going over this entire winter, I would agree that it seems that the AO has been the most impactful in terms of the forecast. So the fact that the AO is forecast to be positive gives me additional confidence that it will be a little warmer than average. So that's how I get to my final
Phil. Well, and I'll just mention Philip's performed pretty well here, I believe, right, Philip? Yeah, Philip's been one of the better performers here, if not the best in terms of human forecasts this winter, with at least you know, with a minimum of 10 or 15 forecasts. So, Dave, before we move on, any tough questions for Philip and his forecast? Okay. Let's see, Zach, would you like to give us your 2-minute drill?
Yeah, sounds good. My forecast for this period was for 51.6 HDDs and a slightly below normal or slightly above normal spread of 20.1. I kept my formula the same as the last couple of weeks. It's been working pretty well. The only downsides to my forecast is I've been upping my spreads a little bit, and that's caused it to not perform as well. But for the most part, my numbers that the formula has produced have been directionally correct, so I consider that a positive. Anyway, I kept the formula the same, and when I was looking at the models, I saw there was some warmth in the EC leading up to the period, and then once we hit that 16 to 20 day period, there wasn't really any significant warmth. There was a little bit in the southern US, but what I did notice is that if the pattern shifts slightly, that there's a significant amount of cold in central Canada that could dip down into the US. And then switching to the CFS, I saw something similar, actually more pronounced, in that there was a lot of cold, and that in that 16 to 20 day period, there was significant cold in parts of the northern US, specifically in those high demand regions. And then to follow that, the CPC was also showing that pattern that Michael pointed out with below normal cold in the regions that are still accumulating HDDs. So although my formula produced a value slightly warmer than the 30-year normal, I upped my spread to account for what could potentially be a cold verification, with some of that cold dipping into our regions of interest.
Yeah, thank you. Any questions for Zach? By the way, I like how I don't really like a question, but I think it's good. Again, when you're doing that 2-minute drill and you're speaking to a client, I think it is helpful to bring up performance, right? Whether it's good or bad, right? Address it either way. So I think, Philip, maybe next time let's try that. Talk about your performance and stuff, because it's not for the intent of bragging, especially if you've done well. It's about providing context, right? Like if on the other end, I want to know, right? If you're giving me a forecast, one of the things I want to know, and I could look at it, but I want you to tell me, is just tell me your performance. So I have a benchmark. Hey, listen, I've been 50% better than the numerical guidance over the last 8 weeks. That's to me, that's a relevant data point on both sides. If you've been 50% worse, why, right? Or something like that. So just something to think about for next time.
Cool.
Let's see. Yeah, I don't think I have any questions. I think maybe Dave had to jump or something like that. I'm not sure. So we have a couple minutes left. Dr. Decker, would you like to give us your forecast?
Sure. So I, as always, turn that CPC forecast into a number. And as I think it was Mike noted, there is a forecast of cooler conditions in the Northeast, extending through the Mid-Atlantic and most of the Midwest. So I went on the cool side, so elevated numbers of HDDs somewhat compared to the normal, and or at least compared to the 30-year moving average, I should say. And they did note, and you can see it in the forecast, right, with the warmth in the southeast, that implies there's going to be a fairly significant baroclinic zone stretching across from, I don't know, Virginia to Missouri, roughly. And they noted that that was a feature they saw in the dynamical forecasts. We kind of saw that with the ridge in the southeast, I think, in both the CFS and the ECMWF, and then more of a trough across eastern Canada, eastern North America. So that implies there is this baroclinic zone. So if it shifts, and perhaps a fairly strong baroclinic zone during this period. So if it were to shift a little further north or south, that could have a big impact on the HDDs over this period. So I bumped up my sigma a little bit to account for that uncertainty, and just, will places like DC be on the warm side or the cold side of that front, and hence contribute to more or less HDDs. So I bumped up my sigma a little bit, again, compared to the 30-year values.
I was just thinking that that's a really good point. And I think you might be the first one to bring it up today, but or at least to emphasize it. The temperature gradient, right? The projected temperature gradient, because I know in previous calls we've talked about that arguably that could be one of, if not the most important factor in terms of forecast confidence, right? Because of exactly what Dr. Decker said. So it's an interesting point. Well, maybe we'll leave it there. I've already talked enough anyway. But any last parting thoughts before we close it out? Okay. All right. Thanks. Thank you, everyone, for, I think, a lot of good participation today. Everyone stay healthy, and guess we'll see you guys hopefully next week. Thanks, guys.
See ya.
Take care.
Okay.
All right. Bye, guys.
Bye.